Karen, you're standing on a legacy, but you're treating it like a zoning violation. I watched the vein in Karen Willington's neck pulse as she pointed a trembling finger at the rustic barn that now anchored the edge of my field. Behind her, the colonial sand houses of the Oaks stood in rigid beige formation, a suburban army waiting for her command to advance. Beside me, Sam leaned back with the casual ease of a man who'd spent his life outrunning wildfires, while Peterson looked at the honeycomb in his hands as if it were a live grenade. The air didn't smell like expensive lavender candles anymore. It smelled like damp earth, goat feed, and the slow-burning fuse of a neighborhood revolution. What started as a simple boundary dispute over 3 inches of grass had curdled into an all-out war for the soul of the back five. Karen didn't just want my weeds mowed. She wanted my sanctuary paved, subdivided, and sold to the highest bidder. She had the HOA bylaws and a developer's deep pockets on her side, but she'd forgotten one crucial detail. I had the dirt. From the arrival of 20 tons of aromatic fertilizer to the legal shield of a registered small farm, this is the story of how a single surveyor's stake became the front line in a battle against the beige empire, and how a few screaming goats finally taught the HOA exactly where their jurisdiction ends. Today's story is from Nick Bryanson, and he didn't buy 5 acres of wild fescue just to watch it get strangled by a beige-toned covenant. After 15 years of grinding in a windowless cubicle to pay for a perfect life, he realized that peace isn't found in a manicured lawn. It's found in the dirt, the grit, and the freedom to let things grow messy. He's the guy who stands on the property line because he knows exactly what it costs to draw it. He protects this field not just for the goats or the garden, but to keep the last bit of unscripted earth from being paved over by people who think community means conformity. Before we dive in, please do me a favor and smash that like button now and comment below on what you would have done if you were in Nick's situation. The sun was hitting the boundary line of my property with surgical precision, highlighting the exact spot where civilized society ended and my personal sanctuary began. I stood on my back deck, coffee in hand, looking at the contrast. To my left was my house at 42 Willow Lane, a perfectly respectable 4-bedroom craftsman with a lawn so green and short it looked like a pool table. It was part of the Oaks Homeowners Association, a community dedicated to the preservation of beige siding and the aggressive suppression of any blade of grass over 3 inches. I'd played the game for 3 years, keeping my shutters painted colonial sand and my bins tucked neatly out of sight. To my right, separated only by a row of surveyor's stakes I'd driven into the dirt myself, was the back five. The back five was a 5-acre rectangular slice of heaven. It was zoned rural residential by the county, but I hadn't built so much as a birdhouse on it. It was just a field, a glorious, messy explosion of goldenrod, wild fescue, and the occasional stubborn blackberry bush. I'd bought it at the same time as the house, but as a completely separate title. I'd done it for the buffer. I didn't want a neighbor's McMansion peering into my bedroom window, and I certainly didn't want another set of HOA rules telling me what kind of mulch I could use. In the house, I was member number 402. In the field, I was just Nick Bryanson, king of the weeds. The peace lasted exactly until Karen Willington took over as board president. I saw her before I heard her. She was power walking down the cul-de-sac with a clipboard tucked under her arm like a weapon. She wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a man in a sharp navy suit and a hard hat, clutching a roll of blueprints. They stopped at the edge of my driveway, their eyes tracking the transition from my manicured lawn to the wild stalks of the field. Karen didn't wave. She didn't say morning. She just pointed a manicured finger at my field as if it were a crime scene. "Nick," she called out, her voice carrying that specific frequency of, "I'm doing this for your own good. We need to talk about the state of your lot. The aesthetics committee is having a collective heart attack. This meadow is a direct violation of Article 4, Section 2 of the Charter." I leaned against the railing, taking a slow sip of coffee. "Morning, Karen. Which lot?" "Because 42 Willow is well within the 3-inch limit. I checked this morning with a ruler." She stepped over the imaginary line, her designer sneakers sinking into the soft earth of the field. The man in the suit followed, looking at the land with the hungry eyes of a shark. "Don't be pedantic, Nick," Karen snapped, clicking her pen. "I've been talking with Marcus Thorne here. He's with Stonegate Development. He's pointed out that this field is a void in our community's master plan. It's a fire hazard, a haven for vermin. And frankly, it's bringing down the property values of every home on this street. Marcus stepped forward, unrolling a corner of his blueprints. Nick, we're looking at a Phase 2 expansion for the Oaks. 6 premium lots, cul-de-sac access. If you legally merge this parcel with your house lot and bring it into the HOA, we can talk about a very lucrative buyout. You'd be doing the whole neighborhood a favor. And if I don't? Karen's smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a cold, calculated expression. Then the fines for vicarious blight start today. $100 a day for the weeds, another $50 for that unapproved woodpile. Since you are a member of the association, the board has determined that your conduct on any adjoining land falls under our purview. We represent the community, Nick. If you won't bring that land up to code voluntarily, we'll fine you until the lien on your house is big enough for us to force a forensic sale. She wasn't just trying to make me mow. She was trying to bankrupt me so she could hand my sanctuary over to the bulldozers and get a kickback from Stonegate. Karen, I said, my voice dangerously calm. You're currently trespassing. That land is on a separate deed, under a different zoning, and is exactly 0% your business. Get off my field before I call the sheriff. She didn't move at first, her face turning a shade of red that matched her lipstick. We'll see how brave you are when the first bill arrives, Nick. The Oaks always grows. It's in the bylaws. You can't hide behind a surveyor's stake forever. I watched them walk away, their heads together, already carving up my back 5 into 0.2-acre lots. They thought they had me cornered by the HOA's fine structure. What they didn't realize was that as long as that field was rural residential, I could do things with it that would make Karen's head spin. The first yellow envelope didn't come by post. It was tucked under my windscreen wiper like a parking ticket from a particularly spiteful meter maid. I found it on Monday morning as I was heading out for coffee. The header was embossed with the HOA's pretentious logo, an oak leaf that looked more like a grasping hand. Notice of violation, parcel 88B, adjoining 42, Willow Lane. Violation, failure to maintain ground cover and unapproved storage of agricultural debris. Daily fine, $150. I stared at the parcel 88B part. They weren't even pretending anymore. By assigning my field a designation in their own internal filing system, they were mentally colonizing it. The agricultural debris was a neat pile of cedar logs I'd seasoned for my fireplace, sitting 20 feet past the HOA boundary. I didn't go to the coffee shop. I drove straight to the county records office. The clerk, a woman named Barb who looked like she'd survived 3 decades of property disputes on a diet of black coffee and spite, pulled up my file with a series of aggressive keystrokes. Still 2 separate titles, honey, Barb said, squinting at the screen. 42 Willow is definitely in the Oakleaf subdivision. But your field? That's unincorporated rural residential. Zoning code R2. It's got a different tax ID, a different legal description, and exactly 0 recorded covenants. So, theoretically, I leaned over the counter, could an HOA fine me for what I do on the R2 lot just because I live in the house next door? Barb laughed, a dry, raspy sound that turned into a cough. They can send you pieces of paper, sure. They can even try to file a lien. But without a covenant of joinder signed by you and recorded by me, they've got as much legal right to that field as I do to the moon. They're banking on you being too scared or too broke to tell them to shove it. Or they're banking on a fast-track foreclosure, I muttered. As I walked back to my truck, I spotted a familiar black SUV idling in the far corner of the car park. Marcus Thorne was behind the wheel, talking animatedly to Karen in the passenger seat. They didn't see me. Marcus handed her a thick, white envelope, the kind that usually holds a contract or a kickback. It clicked. Karen wasn't just being a busybody. She was a scout. If she could manufacture enough debt through these vicarious fines, she could eventually move to seize the property for remediation. Once the HOA held the title, they'd flip it to Stonegate for a song. Marcus would get his Phase 2 expansion, and Karen would likely get a consulting fee that would pay for her next 3 cruises. I went home and looked at my field. It was beautiful, wild, and currently a liability. If they wanted to treat my field like it was part of their manicured little world, I was going to show them exactly what rural residential really meant. I grabbed my phone and called an old friend from university, Dave, who ran a large-scale landscaping and supply outfit. Hey, Dave, remember that favor you owe me? I need a delivery. Not mulch, and definitely not colonial sand gravel. I need something aromatic. About 20 tons of it. And I need it dropped right on the edge of my property line. The one facing the Willington sunroom. Nick, Dave chuckled. You talking about the grade A organic fertilizer? The kind that smells like a cattle ranch in mid-July, I confirmed. And while you're at it, find me the phone number for that guy who leases out pygmy goats for natural brush clearing. Tell him I've got 5 acres of high-quality weeds and a very specific point to prove. I hung up and looked at the yellow notice. I didn't tear it up. I folded it neatly and put it in my pocket. The war for the back five had officially moved past the border skirmish phase. Karen wanted a suburban paradise. I was about to give her a farm. Tuesday morning in the Oaks usually smelled like expensive laundry detergent and climate-controlled success. By Tuesday afternoon, thanks to Dave's delivery, it smelled like the business end of a cattle ranch in a heat wave. Dave's truck, a rusted, prehistoric Mack that looked like it had been salvaged from a scrap heap, roared into the cul-de-sac at 7 a.m. The engine didn't just vibrate, it shook the windows of every colonial sand house on the street, rattling the porcelain figurines in Karen's sunroom. Where do you want the liquid gold, Nick? Dave yelled over the rhythmic thrum of the diesel engine, a grin splitting his bearded face. I walked to the very edge of the back five, precisely 6 inches past my surveyor's stake and approximately 20 feet from the screened-in porch where Karen usually held her strategic aesthetics meetings. I pointed to a spot that would catch the prevailing westerly breeze perfectly. Right there, Dave. Make it a monument. The hydraulic hiss was the sweetest sound I'd heard all year. 20 tons of grade A organic fertilizer, a potent, steaming blend of aged steer manure and decomposing silage, slid out of the bed in a glorious dark brown heap. It was a masterpiece of rural residential zoning. By noon, the aroma had matured. It wasn't just a smell. It was a physical presence that occupied the back of your throat and made your eyes water. I was sitting on my porch, sipping a cold lemonade and enjoying the silence, when Karen's front door flew open. She was wearing a crisp white linen suit and carrying a tray of artisanal finger sandwiches. She took one step onto her porch, halted mid-stride, and her face went through a fascinating series of contortions. Disbelief, then disgust, then a primal sort of horror. She didn't walk over this time. She marched, her heels sinking into her own perfectly manicured sod with every step. She stopped at the invisible line, clutching a silk handkerchief to her face. "Nick!" she shrieked, her voice muffled and nasal. "What in the name of God is that? That stench?" "Fertilizer, Karen?" I said, not looking up from my book. "I'm prepping the soil for a specialized heritage crop. Very nutrient-heavy. The County Agricultural Extension recommends a deep layer application for optimal yield in R2 zones." "You can't do this," she yelled, her face turning a shade of purple that clashed horribly with her suit. "There are ordinances against biohazards. This is a residential neighborhood. The smell is drifting into my ventilation system." "Actually," I said, finally standing up and walking to the boundary, "this is an unincorporated rural residential zone. Agricultural activities, including soil amendment and the storage of organic fertilizers, are protected under the state's Right to Farm Act. Since this isn't HOA land, your nuisance bylaws have no teeth here. But I appreciate the concern for my topsoil." Just then, the black SUV pulled into her driveway. Marcus Thorne stepped out, looking dapper in a gray tailored suit, until the wall of scent hit him. He doubled over, gagging into his hand, and scrambled back toward the vehicle. "Karen," he wheezed, "we can't show the site to the investors with that sitting there. The wind is blowing directly toward the proposed Phase 2 cul-de-sac. It's unbearable." Karen turned back to me, her eyes narrowed into predatory slits. "You think you're clever, Nick? But you're just making the remediation process easier for us. Every day that pile sits there, I'm adding a public health menace surcharge to your account. I've already drafted the emergency board resolution. By the time we're done, the fines will be worth more than the dirt they're sitting on." "Good luck with that, Karen," I said, leaning against my fence post and inhaling a deep, pungent lungful of the future. "Because tomorrow, the goats arrive, and they're very vocal when they're hungry." I watched them retreat into her house, Marcus looking like he was about to lose his breakfast. They thought they could find me into a corner. They didn't realize that in an R2 zone, I wasn't just a homeowner. I was a sovereign of the soil. And farmers have a very high tolerance for bull crap. The goats arrived at 6 a.m. on Wednesday in a rusted livestock trailer that rattled like a toolbox falling down a flight of stairs. It was pulled by a dually truck that belched black smoke, providing a lovely aesthetic contrast to the pristine Teslas and Audis parked in the surrounding driveways. There were four of them, a surly alpine with a beard like a wizard and a gaze that suggested he'd seen the heat death of the universe, and three hyperactive pygmies that seemed to view gravity as a mere suggestion. The owner, a weathered man named Silas, who smelled exclusively of loose-leaf tobacco and damp hay, hopped out and began unlatching the gate. "They'll eat the weeds, the briars, and probably the siding off your house if you let 'em," Silas grunted, handing me a frayed lead rope. "And just so you know, they're screamers." "Screamers?" I asked, looking at the alpine. As if on cue, the goat opened its mouth and let out a sound that was less bleat and more middle-aged man falling off a very high ladder. It was a blood-curdling, human-like shriek that echoed perfectly off the side of Karen's house, followed immediately by the sound of a window slamming shut. By 9 a.m., the emergency board meeting had been moved from Karen's sunroom to the community clubhouse. Apparently, the combination of 20 tons of grade A fertilizer and the vocal stylings of the goats had finally breached her double-glazed windows. I showed up in my work boots, a light dusting of hay on my shoulders, and took a seat at the back of the hall. Karen sat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by Marcus Thorne, and a twitchy-looking guy in a cheap suit whom I recognized as the HOA's legal counsel, Mr. Henderson. The room was packed with neighbors. Half of them looked furious about the smell. The other half looked secretly impressed that someone had finally made Karen's eye twitch. "This meeting is called to order," Karen announced, her voice tight and hovering an octave higher than usual. "The issue at hand is the flagrant, malicious violation of community standards by the resident at 42 Willow Lane. Not only is Mr. Bryanson maintaining a biohazard on his adjoining lot, but he has now introduced noisy livestock into a quiet residential zone." "It's not an HOA zone, Karen," I called out from the back, leaning my chair against the wall. "It's R2, rural residential. The goats are just natural lawnmowers." "It will be an HOA zone by the end of this hour," she snapped, her knuckles whitening as she gripped her gavel. She turned to the lawyer. "Mr. Henderson, explain the doctrine of implied reciprocity." Henderson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses and pointedly avoiding my gaze. "Well, the argument we're preparing is that because Mr. Bryanson's primary residence, and by extension his person, benefits from the HOA's infrastructure, the paved roads, the street lights, the professional landscaping of the common areas, any contiguous land he owns effectively becomes part of the common interest community. We are moving to facilitate a hostile annexation of Parcel 88B to protect the property values of the collective." Marcus Thorne leaned forward, his shark-like developer's grin back in place. "Once the land is annexed, Nick, the fertilizer and the goats become immediate Level 1 violations. We'll have the legal authority to enter the property, remove the nuisances at your personal expense, and move forward with the Phase 2 development. It's for the greater good of the Oaks." The room went silent. This was the nuclear option. If they could force my land into the HOA without my consent, the back five was as good as paved. I stood up slowly, pulling a folded, coffee-stained piece of paper from my pocket. It wasn't a map or a deed. It was a printout I'd grabbed from the county archive's deepest digital cellar an hour before the meeting. "That's a lovely theory, Mr. Henderson," I said, walking toward the front of the room. "But there's one small problem. Before I bought 42 Willow, this entire area was a dairy farm. When the original developers carved out the Oaks, they left the back five as a buffer parcel with a very specific, ironclad deed restriction. It's written into the county charter from 1984. I laid the paper on the table right in front of Karen. She reached for it, her brow furrowing as she scanned the legalese. "It says here," I continued, my voice echoing in the hall, "that the back five can never be incorporated into a private homeowners association without a unanimous vote from the County Planning Commission. And since the commission chairman is a man who happens to value agricultural heritage, and who I happen to have shared a very long lunch with yesterday, I think your annexation is dead on arrival." The silence in the room was no longer tense. It was absolute. Karen's face went from pale to a mottled, dusty purple that matched her blazer. "And as for the goats," I added, leaning over the table until I was eye to eye with Marcus, "they're not pets. They're biological vegetation management. Under the Right to Farm Act, they are a protected agricultural tool. If you or your remediation crew set one foot on that field to move them, I won't just call the sheriff. I'll have the USDA out here for livestock interference. That's a federal headache you don't want. Karen looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the floor. The hostile annexation had just hit a very solid, very smelly brick wall. The following morning, the silence on Willow Lane was broken not by the goats, but by the rhythmic, metallic clink, clink, clink of jackhammers hitting pavement. I walked out to my driveway, coffee in hand, to find a crew of 3 men in neon orange vests unloading a stack of heavy-duty, powder-coated steel bollards from a flatbed truck. They weren't working on the houses. They were drilling deep, jagged holes into the asphalt of the cul-de-sac. Specifically, the narrow strip of public road that served as the only paved access point to the gate of my field. Karen was standing on her lawn, arms crossed over her chest, looking like a queen surveying a conquered province. Marcus Thorne was beside her, leaning against the hood of his black SUV, checking his watch with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Morning, Nick," Karen called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "The board had a very productive emergency session last night after you left. Since the back five isn't part of the HOA, it stands to reason that the HOA's private roads, which we maintain with our hard-earned dues, cannot be used for commercial or agricultural transport to an external, non-member parcel. We're designating this a residential-only access zone, effective immediately." I walked to the edge of my driveway and looked at the bollards. They were being positioned with surgical malice, spaced perfectly to prevent a truck, a tractor, or even a small livestock trailer from entering the gate to my field. I could still walk through them, but my biological vegetation management was effectively trapped, and no more aromatic deliveries or maintenance equipment could get through. "You're blocking a utility easement, Karen," I said, stepping over to the crew. "The power lines for the whole street run right under that gate." "Actually," Marcus chimed in, stepping forward and tapping a folder, "the easement only applies to the primary residence at 42 Willow for domestic purposes. Your field, being a separate title outside the association, has no recorded right-of-way over HOA-maintained asphalt. You want to get to your field with a vehicle? Fly in. Or better yet, merge the lots today, and I'll have these bollards pulled before lunch. We might even throw in a signing bonus for the Phase 2 contract." It was a clever, suffocating move. They couldn't legally annex the land, so they were going to starve it of access. Without a way to get equipment in to manage the brush, the field would eventually become a genuine fire hazard in the eyes of the county. Then, the fire marshal, not the HOA, would step in and force me to clear it or face state-level fines. I went back inside, bypassed the coffee pot, and pulled out the thick, leather-bound binder of the Oaks, CC&Rs. I spent 4 hours highlighting sections with a neon pink marker until my eyes burned. Then, buried under a subclause about holiday lighting durations, I saw it. Article 9, Section 4. The association shall maintain and keep all common roadways and access points unobstructed to ensure the safe passage of emergency, utility, and essential maintenance vehicles at all times. I smiled. I didn't call the sheriff, and I didn't call my lawyer. Instead, I called Silas, the goat man. "Silas, those goats of yours, they're technically maintenance animals for vegetation control, right? And you mentioned your brother-in-law runs that heavy equipment rental place over in the next county?" The next morning at 8 a.m., the residential-only piece of Willow Lane was shattered by the arrival of a massive 50-ton mobile crane. It didn't try to drive through the bollards. It parked legally on the public street, directly in front of my house, and extended its massive yellow hydraulic boom over the HOA's private road, hovering directly over the fence line of the back five. I'd spent the morning painting a massive neon orange sign on the side of my shed, visible from every single window in Karen's house. It read, "Official Agricultural Maintenance Zone. Crane access permitted per County R2 zoning." As the crane began lifting a fresh 2-ton industrial bin of high-protein goat feed and a 500-gallon water tank over the fence, Karen came screaming out of her house, still in her silk bathrobe. "You can't have a crane in a cul-de-sac. It's a safety violation. It's an eyesore. My guests are arriving for the garden club in an hour." Article 9, Section 4, Karen, I yelled back over the hum of the hydraulics. "The HOA has a legal duty to ensure access for maintenance vehicles. Since the board blocked the road, I had to hire a specialized aerial maintenance platform to service the field's biological assets. And per the bylaws, any extraordinary costs incurred by a member due to the board's failure to provide road access are, let's see, reimbursable by the association. I walked over to the property line and handed her a folded invoice for the crane rental. 2,500 for the day with a 4-day minimum. I'll expect a check by Friday, I said, leaning against my mailbox. Or I can just start a lien against the HOA's common areas. I hear the clubhouse has a lot of equity, and I'd hate to see the pool closed because of a maintenance debt. Karen looked at the crane, then at the $10,000 total on the invoice, then at the chewing goats, who were now shrieking at the sight of their fresh food. For the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine panic in her eyes. She wasn't just losing the battle. She was bankrupting the board to fight a man with a 5-acre buffer and a very long memory. The following Monday, the colonial sand harmony of the Oaks didn't just crack, it curdled. It started with the emergency assessment notices, in a desperate, frantic bid to cover the $10,000 crane invoice and the mounting consultation fees for Mr. Henderson's legal posturing. Karen had been forced to trigger a special infrastructure levy. By 9 a.m., every household in the HOA had been hit with an electronic notification for a one-time, non-negotiable $400 bill. By 10 a.m., my front porch had become the most popular destination in the neighborhood. "Nick, what the hell is this?" shouted Miller, my neighbor from 3 doors down. He was marching up my driveway, waving his smartphone like it was a live grenade. "The board says we're paying for unauthorized agricultural interference. Since when do I pay $400 for your goats to scream at the moon?" "You're not paying for the goats, Miller," I said, leaning casually against my porch railing and gesturing toward the cul-de-sac with my coffee mug. "You're paying for Karen's bollards. She illegally blocked the access to my private field, so per Article 9, Section 4 of the bylaws, the HOA has to foot the bill for the specialized maintenance platform I had to hire to bypass them. It's the law of the land she claims to run." As more neighbors gathered, people in gym gear, retirees in cardigans, and young professionals working from home, the crane provided the perfect backdrop. I'd kept it on site for an extra day just for the optics. With a low, rhythmic hydraulic hum, the operator swung a large, empty water trough in a wide arc over Karen's roof. The goats, sensing a captive audience, let out a series of perfectly timed, man-like shrieks that echoed off the crisp white gables of the Willington residence. The crowd's attention shifted from me to Karen's house. She was visible behind her sheer curtains, a rigid silhouette clutching a phone to her ear. "Wait a minute," said Sarah, a young mother from the next street over. "You mean our dues are going up during a recession because she's fighting a personal ego war over a field that isn't even part of this association?" "Exactly," I said, pitching my voice so it carried to the back of the group. "And that guy Marcus Thorne you see her whispering with? He's not a landscaping consultant. He's a developer for Stonegate. If Karen wins this, she isn't protecting your aesthetic integrity. She's paving my buffer zone. Imagine 2 years of dump trucks, construction dust, and 6 more houses squeezed into that space, staring right into your backyards." The mood shifted instantly. In an HOA, people care about 2 things above all else: their property value and their bank balance. Karen was currently setting fire to both. By noon, the garden club luncheon next door had turned into a full-scale mutiny. I watched from my deck as 3 of the other board members, people who usually followed Karen like loyal ducklings, marched up her driveway. They weren't carrying floral arrangements or finger sandwiches. They were carrying a printed petition for special meeting to remove the president for gross fiscal mismanagement. Marcus Thorne's black SUV was idling out front, but as the shouting from inside the house grew loud enough to startle the goats, he didn't stick around. He slipped out the side door, climbed into his car, and peeled out of the cul-de-sac, his tires chirping as he narrowly avoided clipping one of his own steel bollards. He was a corporate shark. He knew when there was blood in the water, and he had no intention of being the one eaten. 10 minutes later, the bollard crew returned in their flatbed truck. But they weren't drilling any more holes. Under the silent, icy glares of the gathered homeowners, they began unbolting the steel posts from the fresh asphalt. Karen finally emerged from her front door. She looked smaller than she had 2 days ago. Her white linen suit was wrinkled, her perfect bob was frazzled, and her face was a ghostly ashen gray. She didn't look at the neighbors, and she certainly didn't look at me. She just watched in silence as the physical barrier to my field was dismantled and tossed into the back of the truck. I walked down to the very edge of the property line, meeting her at the rusted surveyor's stake. "The crane leaves this afternoon," I said quietly, the sound of the goats chewing filling the silence between us. And I'll drop the reimbursement claim against the board if and only if you sign a formal, recorded disclaimer of interest regarding the back five. No annexation attempts, no more vicarious fines, and definitely no more Marcus Thorne. Karen looked at the field, then back at the angry crowd of homeowners still lingering on the street, many of whom were filming her on their phones. Her empire of beige was in ruins. "You've ruined the integrity of this community, Nick," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and defeat. "No, Karen," I replied, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "I just reminded you exactly where your jurisdiction ends. With Karen's board presidency hanging by a thread and the bollards gone, the street fell into a heavy, watchful silence. But I knew the Oaks was a collective with a short memory. Once the $400 assessment sting faded, the complaints about the smell of my fertilizer would start up again. I needed a permanent shield. On Wednesday, I drove down to the county assessor's office. I wasn't there to fight a fine. I was there to change my identity. "I'd like to file a primary production tax exemption for parcel 88B, I told the clerk, the same Barb who'd helped me before. She peered over her spectacles. "You've got the acreage for it, Nick, but you need to prove a commercial intent. You can't just have pet goats." "They aren't pets, Barb. They're the foundation of Bryanson's heritage goat dairy and artisanal brush clearing services," I said, handing her a folder. Inside was a business registration, a basic tax ID, and a copy of a contract I'd signed with Silas to sell him organic compost, also known as my mountain of manure. Barb stamped the papers with a satisfying thwack. "Done. Your field is now officially a registered small farm. That gives you a 60% property tax break and, more importantly, right to farm state protections. No local ordinance or private covenant can interfere with standard agricultural practices now." I went home and nailed a new sign to my gate. Warning: working farm. Protected by state agricultural law. The reaction was instantaneous. Karen, now demoted to general member after the board stripped her of her presidency in a landslide vote, stood on her porch watching as I hauled in a second-hand milking stanchion. The new board president, a reasonable guy named Peterson, who just wanted the lawsuits to stop, walked over to the fence. "Nick, look, we pulled the bollards. We're vacating the fines. Can we just lose the manure pile? The smell is making it hard for people to sell their houses." "I'm a farmer now, Peterson," I said, wiping grease off my hands. "And as a farm, I'm required by the state to maintain best practices for soil health. That pile stays until it's—" "But tell you what, if the HOA signs a restrictive easement acknowledging that this land can never be annexed or developed into residential lots, I'll move the processing area to the far back corner of the 5 acres. Peterson sighed, looking at the goats who were currently chewing on a discarded HOA Rules and Regulations handbook. "You're holding the whole neighborhood hostage with goat poop, Nick." "No," I corrected him. "I'm protecting my borders. If Marcus Thorne ever comes back, he'll find a farm, not a phase 2. Your property values stay high because you'll always have a view of green space. You just have to learn to love the smell of green." By Friday, the legal team for the HOA had drafted the easement. They were so terrified of the small farm status bringing in pigs or a rooster that they were willing to sign anything to keep me low impact. I had my buffer. I had my tax break. And best of all, I had the legal right to be as unbeige as I wanted. The black SUV returned on Tuesday morning, but it didn't stop at Karen's curb. Marcus Thorne parked right on the public shoulder of the road, his front bumper nudging my gate. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit this time. He was in rugged work boots and a high-vis vest, flanked by a surveyor and a technician lugging a ground-penetrating radar unit. I walked down to the fence line, my alpine goat trailing behind me like a four-legged, bearded bodyguard. "You're a long way from the sales office, Marcus. Did you lose your way to the nearest strip mall?" Marcus didn't look up from his tablet. He was tapping at a digital map with a stylus. "Actually, Nick, I'm right where I need to be. I spent the weekend in the dusty corner of the county archives. It turns out that back in the 50s, when this whole valley was a dairy farm, there was a private sewage and graywater easement that ran directly through the center of this field to the creek." He finally looked at me, and that predatory shark grin was wider than ever. "The easement was never formally vacated when the subdivision was built. It's still on the books, and as the developer of the adjacent land, Stonegate has the legal right to improve and maintain existing utility corridors to service the surrounding community. I don't need to annex your land to dig it up, Nick. I just need to service the line. My heart sank. A utility easement was a different beast entirely. If he could prove he had a right to maintain that corridor, he could turn my meadow into a muddy, bifurcated trench for months. He could kill my small farm operations and make the land a noisy, dangerous construction site that no goat or human would want to be near. You're going to excavate 5 acres of protected agricultural soil for a clay pipe that hasn't seen a drop of water in 70 years? I asked, gripping the fence post. Maintenance is a very broad term in the eyes of the court, Nick, Marcus said, patting the gate. We'll start the exploratory excavation on Monday. By the time we're done testing the integrity of the line, your field will be a 6-foot deep canyon. I suspect you'll be much more open to a buyout once your goats start falling into trenches. He walked away, whistling a tune that sounded suspiciously like a victory march. He thought he'd found the ultimate back door into my sanctuary, a way to destroy the land's value without ever having to own it. I didn't panic. I went back to my office and pulled up the very same archives Marcus had been raiding. I found the easement, a dotted line cutting right through the heart of the back 5. But then I looked at the specific date of the original grant, September 1954. I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with the State Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, and a drainage specialist who charged $300 an hour just to listen to my problem. Is it still an active corridor? I asked. Technically, yes, the specialist said. But there's a massive catch Marcus is ignoring. Any utility line installed before 1970 that carries untreated effluent or heavy agricultural runoff is subject to the Legacy Contamination Act. If he digs that up and breaks those old, brittle clay pipes, he is legally and financially responsible for any historic hazardous discharge into the local watershed. I smiled. I knew exactly what had been pumped through those pipes for 20 years. Raw dairy waste, chemical fertilizers, and God knows what from the old milking sheds. If Marcus broke ground, he wasn't just digging a hole. He was opening a multi-million-dollar Pandora's box of environmental liability. Monday morning arrived. A yellow backhoe sat idling at my gate, its diesel fumes drifting toward Karen's house. Marcus stood there, clipboard in hand, looking at his watch. "Last chance, Nick," he called out as I walked toward the gate. "Sign the merger and the sale agreement, and this backhoe turns around. Otherwise, we start digging at 9 sharp." I walked out holding a bright red folder. "Before you drop that bucket, Marcus, you might want to look at the environmental liability indemnity form I've prepared for the county. Since you've declared Stonegate the operator of record for this 1954 effluent line, you are now personally responsible for the containment of any historic sludge." I pointed to a nondescript white car parked behind the backhoe. A man in a windbreaker with DEQ emblazoned on the back stepped out, holding a water testing kit. "This is Inspector Vance," I said. "He's here to monitor the historic discharge the second you break the surface. If even a gallon of that old toxic dairy runoff hits the water table, Stonegate is on the hook for a federal Superfund cleanup. Are you quite sure you want to service this line today?" Marcus looked at the backhoe operator, then at the DEQ inspector, then back at the red folder. The shark grin didn't just fade. It vanished. He realized that by trying to use the easement as a weapon, he'd walked his company into a financial landmine. "This isn't over, Nick," he hissed, signaling the backhoe to shut down. "Actually, Marcus," I said, "it is, because I just filed a motion to have the easement vacated based on environmental hazard. You did the research for me. Thanks." With Marcus and his backhoe retreating in a cloud of shamed diesel exhaust, the neighborhood should have returned to its beige, quiet baseline. But Karen Willington wasn't built for quiet exits. She was built for escalation. On Thursday afternoon, I was served. It wasn't a yellow HOA notice or a corporate summons from Stonegate. It was a private process server in a windbreaker who handed me a thick manila envelope while I was mid-scrub on a goat milking stanchion. Karen was suing me personally in civil court for intentional infliction of emotional distress and tortious interference with property enjoyment. She was seeking $50,000 in damages, plus legal fees. The complaint was a work of fiction that would have made a Victorian novelist weep. According to her lawyer, my malicious agricultural displays had caused her heart palpitations, chronic insomnia, and a permanent diminished quality of life that prevented her from hosting her prestigious garden parties. She claimed the goats were a psychological weapon designed to harass her and that the manure pile was an act of domestic bioterrorism. I met my lawyer, Elena, a woman who wore power suits like armor and specialized in property rights, at a diner halfway between my house and the county courthouse. She's desperate, Nick, Elena said, flipping through the pages of Karen's grievance with a look of pure clinical detachment. This is a classic slap suit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation. She's trying to bleed you on legal fees until you're forced to sell to the developer just to pay your bills. But she's made a catastrophic tactical error. What's that? I asked, stabbing a piece of bacon. By suing for loss of property enjoyment and emotional distress, she's made her own mental state and financial history part of the case, Elena said, a predatory glint in her eye. We get discovery. That means we get to look at her phone logs, her emails, and most importantly, her bank statements. The discovery phase was a bloodbath. Karen had expected me to roll over and settle. Instead, Elena dismantled Karen's secrets with the precision of a master watchmaker. We didn't just find emails. We found a strategic incentive agreement Marcus Thorne had signed with her. It was a promise of a 2% finder's fee on any land Stonegate acquired through her official assistance. We also found high-resolution drone footage she'd illegally taken of my backyard. It proved she hadn't been suffering from insomnia in bed. She'd been spending her nights at the property line, peering through a night vision lens to take photos of my compost pile for her evidence folders. The settlement conference was held in a windowless room at the courthouse that smelled like old paper and bad coffee. Karen sat across from me, looking haggard. The presidential bob was gone, replaced by hair that looked like it hadn't seen a stylist in weeks. Her lawyer looked like he wanted to jump out the window. "We are prepared to drop the suit and walk away," Karen's lawyer said, his voice flat and defeated. "Not even close," Elena replied, sliding a folder across the table that hit the wood with a heavy thud. "We have proof of a kickback scheme that violates state racketeering laws. We have evidence of harassment and stalking via the drone footage. And we have a counterclaim for abuse of process that will make that $50,000 she's asking for look like pocket change." I leaned forward, looking Karen dead in the eye. The king of the weeds was done playing defense. "Here's the deal, Karen. You drop the suit, you pay every cent of my legal fees, and you sell your house. You're clearly not enjoying the neighborhood anymore, and frankly, neither is anyone else with you in it. The integrity you're so worried about is currently being held together by my goats, and they don't want you as a neighbor." Karen's lip trembled. She looked at the evidence of her secret deal with Marcus Thorne, the one thing that would not only lose her the case, but likely land her in front of a grand jury for HOA fraud and embezzlement. I'll need 90 days to list the house," she whispered, her voice barely audible. 30, I said, "and I want to see the for sale sign on your lawn by noon tomorrow. If I don't, Elena sends this folder to the district attorney." I walked out of the courthouse into the fresh afternoon air. I could almost smell the back five from here. It smelled like manure, goats, and absolute victory. 30 days later, the for sale sign on Karen's lawn was finally slapped with a sold sticker. The moving trucks arrived on a Saturday, hauling away the last of the colonial sand furniture and the many, many binders of HOA grievances. Karen didn't come out to say goodbye. She scurried into her SUV and drove away without a backward glance. Her empire of beige finally reduced to a rearview mirror memory. The new owner was a man named Sam, a retired park ranger with a collection of vintage canoes and a laugh that boomed across the cul-de-sac. On his first day, he walked over to the surveyor's stake with a six-pack of local ale. "I hear you're the man with the goats," Sam said, handing me a bottle. "And I hear you're the reason this street still has a view of something other than a brick wall." "I try my best," I said, clinking my bottle against his. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Sam. Just so you know, the alpine screams when he's hungry, and the fertilizer, well, it's an acquired scent." "Better than the scent of a board meeting," Sam laughed. With Karen gone and the HOA board effectively neutered by the threat of a racketeering lawsuit, the atmosphere in the Oaks shifted. The special assessment had been refunded, paid for by a settlement Marcus Thorne had quietly coughed up to avoid his own legal nightmare. And the neighbors were suddenly much more appreciative of the back five. But I knew I couldn't just sit on the land forever. Eventually, another Karen or another Marcus would come along. I needed to lock the gates for good. I spent the next month working with a local land trust to place the entire 5 acres into a permanent conservation easement. The terms were simple. The land could never be subdivided, annexed, or used for anything other than agricultural or open space. I decided to celebrate by redesigning the layout of the property to show exactly what multi-use looked like. I held a grand opening on a sunny Sunday afternoon. I transformed the front acre, the part directly visible from the cul-de-sac, into an ordered community garden. I'd built raised beds for the neighbors, laid down cedar chip paths, and put up a small, charming greenhouse. Half the neighborhood showed up with seed packets and trowels. Even Peterson, the new board president, arrived with a bag of heirloom tomato starts. "You really did it, Nick," Peterson said, looking at the neat rows of kale and carrots. "It's actually quite beautiful." "This is the introduction to nature for the HOA, I joked. "But follow me." I led a small group of them past the garden beds, through a heavy timber gate, and into the remaining 4 acres. The transition was immediate and deliberate. The manicured paths faded into narrow deer trails. The sun-drenched garden gave way to the deep, cool shadows of a back-4 wilderness. Huge, ancient oaks and thick stands of hickory dominated the landscape. Under the canopy, the goats were happily munching on a patch of invasive ivy near a small, bubbling spring I'd cleared of debris. It was wild, tangled, and completely unreachable by any developer's bulldozer. "This is the heart of the property," I explained, as we stood under a canopy that made the suburban houses feel a million miles away. "The front acre is for the community. The back 4 are for the land. No mowers, no approved mulch, and definitely no phase 2. "It's like having a private forest in our own backyard," Sarah whispered, watching her kids try to track a squirrel up a massive trunk. I stood there for a long time after everyone left. The back 5 was no longer just a vacant field or parcel 88B. It was a sanctuary, protected by the very laws they tried to use against me. As the alpine let out one final, soulful shriek into the twilight, I leaned against my fence and smiled. I was home. And for the first time in years, the only thing I had to worry about was whether the tomatoes were getting enough water. The war of the weeds was over. The goats had won. And that's Nick's story. And if you made it this far, I'd appreciate you dropping a like and maybe throw in a comment to let me know what other HOA stories you'd like to hear. Hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I'll catch you all next time.